Hello and welcome to the very last video in my Bible series. If you have made it this far, or even if you've just watched some of them and dipped into this one, well done. And I really hope it's been useful. What I thought I'd finish off by doing is talking about some books you might want to look at if you want to take things a bit further. I'm in that weird position, as many of us are at the moment, that I'm mainly working from home. So these are the books that I have brought from work to my house at the beginning of the lockdown period that I thought I might use. So some of these are important or might be relevant to you, and I'm going to show you the ones that I think might be of interest. I actually also have to go up to college today to check on the building. We have to go up every so often just to make sure all's well. So while I'm there, I'm going to film another bit of this video in college, in the library, showing you some commentary series and perhaps one or two books on my own bookshelf in the library, in my office at the college there. So it's going to be, I'll just shoot this video in 3 parts. So these are some books that might be of interest if you want to take some of these things further. And this is a slightly eclectic mix of things. Now, I mentioned, I've talked quite a lot about biblical violence, and this is something that I'm very interested in, and I guess that interest has kind of come through a bit. And I realise that not everybody is as interested in that as me. But if that is something that interests you or that bothers you, then there are some books that you might want to read to think a bit further. I've mentioned my own. I'm going to shamelessly plug my own book because it's aimed at people in the churches who are grappling with that particular question. So I hope it might be of use to you. So I'll mention that one. Put that one away now. Other books that might be useful on the subject. This is useful. I think it's a reasonably accessible read. This is John Walton, The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest. And Walton is an expert on the ancient Near East, in other words, on the other cultures around Israel at the time of the Old Testament, and their writings and their culture. And he uses that as a really helpful lens for understanding quite a lot of what's going on in the Old Testament. He's got a whole load of books actually called The Lost World. So there's The Lost World of Genesis 1, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. Perhaps it's The Lost World of Genesis, Lost World of Adam and Eve, and a few others that you can Google. But I do recommend his books. They are really helpful, and all sorts of kind of pennies drop when you read them. I've used 1 or 2 of these ideas as I've been going along, but you'd find a lot more in here. So I do recommend that. Still on the subject of biblical violence, best book I have read on biblical violence well, I've been reading a lot about this recently, well, in the last decade. And the best one I think I have read is this one. Which is quite new. William Webb and Gordon Oster, Bloody, Brutal and Barbaric. It's you need to concentrate with it, but I don't think it's particularly difficult. So I think that would be, for people who are willing to, think hard and concentrate hard, as it were, then it's not going to hand it onto you on a plate, but it would be accessible to you if you wanted to pursue that. A couple of books on the same subject, and then I'll move on from biblical violence. I'm actually only part way through reading this one. It's fairly new, but I have to say it's shaping up to be really helpful. So I can't wholly endorse it yet because I haven't finished reading it, but I do think that it would be one that would be of use to you if you're grappling with these questions. And that's by Daniel Hawke, The Violence of the Biblical God. And this one you really do have to put your thinking cap on. Really, it's a quite an intense read, but not beyond the scope of the non-specialist, but definitely would make you need to concentrate. Paul Copan, Did God Really Command Genocide? So I don't actually wholly agree with Copan's argument, but it's very well argued. Is certainly worth consideration. He may well be right, and I may well be wrong. So yeah, it's a good book. Okay, and 2 more. Sorry, quickly before I move on from violence. In terms of sexual violence, which I've referred to a few times, I've got my own book on domestic abuse coming out in October, called The Bible Doesn't Tell Me So: Why You Don't Have to Submit to Domestic Abuse and Coercive Control, or something. And 2 other books that might be relevant. This is an absolute classic, Phyllis Tribble, Texts of Terror. And she grapples with 5 texts of sexual violence in the 5 texts of violence against women in the Old Testament. I again don't wholly agree with her either, but if you want to think about these questions, this would be the classic book to start with. My own grappling with the violence of the Levite's wife in Judges 19 is here. This is also a specialist monograph, not sort of aimed at the general readership, but not tremendously difficult to read. Trying to remember if I use any Hebrew script even. I do use a tiny bit of Hebrew script, but really not very much at all. So that might be of interest if you wanted to. Now, moving on, or slightly on, a writer that I have come to respect a great deal in the last few years is someone called Lisa Ray Beale. Her commentary on Kings, which is in the Apollos series, was really helpful, I found. It came out partway through my PhD, which I did on Kings. And I found her commentary it was very useful. This is another commentary she's written, quite a recent commentary, the Story of God Bible commentary on the book of Joshua. And I've reviewed this recently. I think this is a really helpful book. It'd be useful for preachers, useful for people who just want to study the book of Joshua. Accessible, but really well founded in scholarship. I highly commend that book to you. Okay, I think that might be. Oh, then I wanted to show you this series, which I've only recently become familiar with, but I think is really good. So, these books here. Right, so these are by Zondervan, that's the publisher, and they are in the Biblical Theology for Life series. Okay, I'll just hold one up to you to show you. So that's the name of the series, Biblical Theology for Life. They're all by different authors. And obviously on different subjects, and they look like that. So I'll show you the ones that I've got here. I haven't read them all in detail, but I've been kind of familiarising myself with this series, and I've been really impressed with what I've seen. So this one is by Brian Rosner, who I have a lot of respect for as a scholar, and this is Biblical Theology of Personal Identity. What is it to be human, really? As the Bible teaches it. So that's a good exploration of that question, I think. As I say, I haven't read any of these from cover to cover, but I have familiarised myself with them. This one, Craig Blomberg, who is also a very well-respected scholar, a biblical theology of stewardship. And then I'll just whiz through the others quickly. One about covenantal discipleship by Jonathan Lunder, one about creation care by Douglas Moo and Jonathan Moo, and one called The Mission of God's People by Chris Wright, who's written quite a lot on that subject. So that's a useful series that I think you might want to, could be a good place to move on to from here. I think that's everything I want to show you from this bookshelf. So, there's another one in that series. Missed it. Mustn't forget that. Nick Perrin, The Kingdom of God, Biblical Theology of the Kingdom. So I think that's everything I want to show you from this bookshelf. And in a moment, then you'll see me somewhere else, and I'll talk you through a few more options. Well, welcome to my office. The bookshelves behind me are looking a bit depleted at the moment. That's because half of them are at home, as you saw. There's a few books here that I think might be of interest, and I thought I'd flag up to you, and then I'm going to go down to the library for the third instalment. Okay, this is a really good book, and it's got a companion that I can't immediately put my hand on, but anyway, it'll give you an idea. This is called The Art of Biblical Narrative by Robert Alter, and there is another one called The Art of Biblical Poetry, a companion volume, and it's about how to learn to read these biblical narratives, Old Testament narratives, and Old Testament poetry as literature, which is a way into reading it for understanding its meaning and its intention better. So it's a really helpful book. It's quite small, as you can see, pretty accessible, and I do commend those to you. This is a book that I read fairly recently, and I think it's really helpful if you wanted to read Exodus. I don't think it's part of a series as far as I can tell. Mark Scarlatta, Abiding Presence, God, the Abiding Presence, is published by SCN, and I thought that was a really good commentary, really well based in scholarship, but also useful, and useful, but accessible as well. So I recommend that. This is a very slim little book, but really good, really good. Gordon Wenham, a highly respected scholar, is writing this from both looking at Genesis 1 to 11 as literature, but also with attention to the other ancient Near Eastern myths and how it stands in distinction to those. It's a very helpful and reasonably accessible introduction to those early stories of the Bible. Right. Ernest Lucas, so Gordon Wenham and Ernest Lucas I have both had the privilege of studying under, both retired now. Ernest Lucas has written this commentary on Proverbs, so I'm using this partly to plug his particular book, but also really to plug this series of commentaries called the Two Horizons. I would say this is kind of mid-level commentary series. I'll show you some downstairs that are perhaps more access level. Two Horizons is somewhere in the middle, as you can see. For the book of Proverbs, with 31 chapters, it's quite a substantial book, and that gives you a kind of clue that this is quite scholarly, but you know, a really good way into the book of Proverbs if you wanted to take things further. I thought I'd show you these three, which I happen to have on my shelf, but they're part of a bigger series. So these are the T&T Clark study guides to the Old Testament, and there is, I think, probably one for each biblical book. These are ones that I happen to have because these are ones that I happen to teach elementary courses on. So we use these as textbooks for first year students here, and if you wanted to dig in a bit deeper, they would be quite a good way in. I thought I'd show you this one, which is a book that I found very helpful for Revelation. I think that they probably are a little bit reductionistic, which means basically that they have kind of one big idea and they apply it to the whole thing. I think perhaps they try to oversimplify it in that way. But you know, anything that makes Revelation a little bit more accessible, and it does help quite a lot in some of the things that I was actually trying to show you yesterday in the Revelation videos, then it might be of use to you. Sorry, so this is Unveiling Empire by Wes Howard Book and Anthony Gweither. I'm briefly going to mention this, which is the Guidelines Bible Notes. So these are, I edit these. No, there's my picture on the back. So these are Bible notes. They're kind of aimed at ministers, really. So people who've got some theological background, some theological education in their background. But I know people who don't have formal theological education who use them as well, and I think find them helpful. So these go a bit deeper than your standard Bible notes. And they are everyone I commissioned to write is a really good scholar. So they are written by scholars who are passionate and I think inspiring, and I think these are good, but then I wouldn't I? And I think there's one more thing I wanted to find, and that is this one, which is Cruciformity by Michael Gorman. Now, do you remember I mentioned this book when we were talking about Corinthians and Philippians, about his identification of this kind of narrative grammar of although yet not but rather. It's not the theme of the whole book, but there are 3 or 4 chapters in here that talk about that in some detail, and a whole lot more besides. This is a fairly tough read, I would say, for someone who hasn't studied theology, but not impossible. So Michael Gorman, Cruciformity, really good, changed the way I thought. Right, finally, I'm going to take you downstairs to the library. I'll see you there in a moment. So here I am going into the library, and of course the building's shut up, so I'm going to put some lights on and I'll show you the library. Here we are. I love a good library. I get very excited by a good library. I'm not going to take you on a complete tour of everything, but I'm just going to show you a few things that I think might be useful to you. Right, so let me just try and show you a few things as I finish. This one is your starter book for studying the Bible. In my opinion, this is the one I recommend to everybody. Gordon Fee, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. It is it's really, really helpful. I cannot recommend it enough. If you buy one book, buy this book. It's really, really good. Takes you through the different styles of writing and teaches you to read according to the type of writing, which is a really important principle. Okay, a couple of Old Testament introductions that might be of use. This is one that I use for some of the first year courses that I teach, Introduction to the Old Testament by John Drain. I'm struggling slightly with not having enough hands right now. There's loads of Old Testament introductions here which are useful. I think this one might also be quite a good one if you wanted an introduction to the Old Testament. I'm reading it backwards. I think it says that by Tremper Longman and Raymond Dillard. Okay, let me try and take you to what I want to show you now is some types of commentaries that might be useful to you. So basically, loads of the publishers have commentary series. Often, one commentary per book, or sometimes with the smaller books they'll pair them up or whatever. But these commentaries they're all doing something different, and they are aimed at a different audience and asking different types of questions. Now, that's not to say that some are more useful than others inherently, but for the reader in the churches, for the person who might be preparing a sermon or wanting to get into the book for your own study, some will be more useful to you than others. So I thought I'd try and give you a quick tour of those. The interpretation of Bible commentaries, this is the Genesis one as it happens. I think this is a good series. I find this quite helpful, good scholarship, fairly accessible, and doing what it says. It's trying to help you to apply it. We've also got this series. Now, I've used this quite a bit in my preparation for each of the videos, quite a lot of the videos, the New International Version application commentaries. So again, there's one per for most of the books. This one I've got in my hand happens to be the Exodus one, I think. Yeah. So I recommend that commentary series. It's useful. What else have we got that I could recommend to you? There's also this more introductory series. There's about 5 of these. So this one is Exploring the Old Testament, the Psalms and Wisdom Literature. So I think they're all called Exploring the Old Testament, and then they depending on which bit of the Old Testament you're talking about will be the name in the bottom right there. So this one is by Ernest Lucas, I think, yes, who I spoke about before. This is a more entry level than the Proverbs commentary I mentioned a few minutes ago. So there's about 5 of these, as I say, something like that, splitting all the types of Old Testament book between them. So that is quite a useful one, quite a useful series. Now, you've also got this commentary series called The Bible Speaks Today, BST, there at the top. Also, The Message of. And again, there's kind of one per almost all the biblical books are covered, I think. There are some older versions and some newer versions. A lot of them have been around long enough that they've commissioned new ones with more up-to-date scholarship. So what have I got here? I've got David Atkinson on Proverbs, as it happens, because I'm working my way along. Now, you know that Old Testament series I said there were about 5 of? There's I just discovered actually that there's a New Testament one as well. So here we are. This is with David Wenham and Steve Walton, I think. Let me just look. Yeah, both of whom have associations with us here, actually. I've been taught by David Wenham, so anything he writes I recommend. And this is in the same series of introductions to the 2 Testaments. This is volume 1, the Gospels and Acts, so I'm guessing there's at least 1, possibly 2 other volumes. So that might well be worth acquiring for your bookshelf if you were so inclined. And then we've got a series of little books. This is the New Testament, or this is part of the New Testament series, Paul for Everyone by Tom Wright. But there's clearly there's ones on the Gospels and there's ones on the non-Pauline letters as well, I think. And I'm assuming there's one on Revelation. There's also the whole series, equivalent series in the Old Testament called things like Isaiah for Everyone and so on. Not by Tom Wright in the Old Testament. These are really accessible. They break the text down into kind of, like 20 verse chunks roughly. Yeah, really easy to read. You could use it actually as a kind of daily devotional. But it's written by Tom Wright, who is both absolutely top-notch scholar and a really good communicator. So as a very introductory and possibly the last thing I want to show you, I'm not quite sure yet. This is a fairly specialist book, really. But do you remember I was talking when we looked at 1 Timothy? I was talking about the situation Timothy was facing in Ephesus to do with the role of women within the church and why perhaps Paul says what he says. What I was saying was taken from this book called I Suffer Not a Woman by the Krogers. That's, if you wanted to sort of follow that up in more detail, quite a lot more detail, as you can see, and again, quite specialised, but that would be the book to look for. So that brings us to the very end of this series. Look, it's a good place to end it in the library there. Look at that. Look at everything that there is to learn. And that's just a small snapshot. As John says at the end of his gospel, if everything that Jesus said and did was written down, the whole world would not contain enough books. And if we expanded that to everything that we can know and say about God and his purposes for humanity, and the exploration of the wonderful things that we have in Scripture, the whole world for sure could not contain enough books. And our lives are not long enough to discover all that there is in God's Word. I really hope that you have enjoyed doing this tour with me. I really hope it's inspired you to go back and or go on and read Scripture for yourself and to dig deeper. Get in touch and keep going in that journey of learning and discovering, and may all your reading and all your study be worship, because there is only one to whom all praise is due.